1825, Western New York. Thousands of men are cutting through earth that, according to the official story, had never been disturbed on this scale before. The Erie Canal is nearing completion. 363 miles of hand-dug trench, tens of thousands of laborers, picks, shovels, black powder, and yet, scattered through the newspapers and local accounts of the 19th century, strange reports keep appearing. Large bones, burials uncovered by excavation, skeletons described in language that sounds almost impossible. We're told these stories were exaggerations, misidentifications, tall tales from another era. Maybe they were, but the deeper I looked, the more that explanation began to collapse. Because the canal diggers weren't working in empty wilderness, they were cutting through ancient landscapes, mounds, burial grounds, places occupied for thousands of years. And here's the part that stayed with me. Why do stories of giant skeletons appear again and again wherever massive excavation projects cut into the earth? Not once, not twice, but across decades, across states, across thousands of miles. Coincidence? Or were the men who built America's canals uncovering something they were never meant to find? And if they did, where did those discoveries go? Before this investigation is over, you'll understand why a simple story about canal construction leads into something much stranger. Because this isn't really about dirt and water, it's about what was buried beneath them. This video follows 4 questions and each one leads deeper. First, who actually dug the great canals of North America, and what do the historical records say? Second, why do newspaper archives from the 19th century repeatedly describe unusual discoveries made during excavation projects? Third, why do similar accounts appear in places separated by hundreds of miles and decades of time? And finally, why do so many of these stories end the same way, with missing remains, forgotten reports, or explanations that seem strangely convenient? We're told that progress transformed a continent, that canals connected cities and opened trade routes. And that's true, but perhaps something else was happening beneath the surface, because every shovel removed layers that had remained untouched for centuries. This is your history hidden from you, not necessarily through conspiracy, but through neglect, assumptions, and stories nobody thought to preserve. By the end, you can decide whether these reports were misunderstandings or fragments of something larger. If you feel that something about the official story doesn't add up, subscribe to The Severed Age and share this with one person who needs to see it, because the deeper this goes, the harder it is to ignore. The accepted story begins in 1817. On July 4th, in Rome, New York, Governor DeWitt Clinton officially broke ground on what critics mockingly called Clinton's folly. Few believed it could be done. The plan sounded absurd. A man-made waterway stretching 363 miles from Albany to Buffalo, crossing forests, swamps, rivers, and rock. There were no steam excavators, no diesel machines, no hydraulic equipment, just manpower. By 1825, after 8 years of work, the Erie Canal stood completed, 40 feet wide, 4 feet deep, 83 locks, 18 aqueducts. It transformed New York into an economic powerhouse and changed the United States forever. Historians estimate that roughly 50,000 laborers worked on the canal. Irish immigrants, farmers seeking seasonal wages, craftsmen, surveyors, and local workers. They dug mostly by hand, aided by horses, oxen, and black powder. The official explanation is straightforward. These men encountered ordinary obstacles: bedrock, flooding, disease, accidents. Malaria killed many workers. Dynamite had not yet been invented, so blasting powder did the heavy work. Nothing mysterious, nothing hidden. And this pattern wasn't limited to New York. By the 1820s and 1830s, the Ohio and Erie Canal and the Chesapeake and Ohio Canal were under construction. Decades later, projects across Illinois and Pennsylvania repeated the process. Everywhere, vast trenches cut through landscapes that had been occupied by Native American cultures for thousands of years. Archaeologists today point out that many canal routes pass near ancient earthworks and mound complexes. That's not surprising. Rivers attracted civilizations long before Europeans arrived, so the accepted narrative makes sense. Large construction projects disturbed old burial grounds. Human remains were occasionally discovered. Newspapers exaggerated the stories. Memories grew taller with every retelling. Case closed. Except the deeper I looked, the more one detail refused to disappear. Because newspapers from the 19th century weren't reporting these discoveries once in a while. They were reporting them constantly. And sometimes the descriptions became very difficult to dismiss. But here's the first anomaly. The official explanation is simple. 19th century newspapers loved sensational stories. Editors competed for readers. Measurements were unreliable. Archaeology barely existed as a science. So naturally, reports of enormous skeletons should be treated with caution. That's the skeptical position. And at first it sounds reasonable. But then you begin reading the papers themselves. Not one paper, dozens. In 1884, investigators working under the Smithsonian's Bureau of Ethnology examined the Criel Mound near South Charleston, West Virginia. Cyrus Thomas and his team documented numerous burials. Among them was a skeleton whose reconstructed height was estimated at approximately 6 feet 8 3/4 inches. Today, historians point out that burial compression and damaged bones can create exaggerated measurements. Fair enough. But Criel Mound wasn't the only case. Local newspapers from Ohio, Wisconsin, Tennessee, and New York repeatedly described large skeletons discovered during excavations, railroad cuts, quarry work, and canal projects. Some accounts mention 7 feet, others 8. Many were probably exaggerated, but all of them. That's where the explanation starts to strain, because the same language appears again and again. Large skulls, double rows of teeth, ancient burial mounds, remains removed for study, and then silence. We're told that these stories represent folklore. Perhaps they do, but folklore usually changes. These accounts don't. The pattern repeats with unsettling precision. An excavation begins. Bones are uncovered. Measurements are recorded. A local doctor or professor examines the remains. The newspapers report the discovery. And then the trail disappears. No museum displays. No photographs. No surviving collections. Nothing. And here's the strangest part. Many of these reports come from places connected by waterways. The Ohio River Valley, western New York, Illinois, Pennsylvania, regions dense with mound complexes and crossed by major canal systems. Coincidence? Possibly, but one question kept bothering me. If thousands of workers were digging through ancient landscapes for decades, how many discoveries never reached the newspapers at all? Because buried inside a report from another state was one detail that changed everything, and almost nobody talks about it. The deeper I looked, the stranger the geography became, because giant stories weren't concentrated in one county or one state. They appear to cross an enormous corridor stretching from western New York through Ohio and into the Mississippi Valley, exactly where ancient earthworks were most abundant, and that's a real historical fact. Long before Europeans arrived, cultures now identified as Adena, Hopewell, and Mississippian peoples built thousands of mounds throughout North America. By the 19th century, many settlers had no idea who created them. Entire communities lived beside these structures without understanding their age or purpose. Excavation changed that. In Ohio, railroad cuts exposed mounds. In Illinois, farmers leveled them. In Pennsylvania, quarry operations disturbed burials. And during canal construction, thousands of laborers carved directly through terrain that had remained undisturbed for centuries. The official explanation is that normal human remains were discovered and exaggerated by newspapers hungry for readers. Again, maybe that's true. But here's where things become difficult. The reports often contained remarkably similar details despite being separated by decades and hundreds of miles. Unusually large skulls, stone chambers, copper artifacts, strange beads, double rows of teeth, skeletons measured by local physicians. Then removal, then silence. Hold that detail. We'll come back to it, because another real historical event was happening at the same time. Beginning in the late 19th century, the Smithsonian Institution's Bureau of American Ethnology launched massive investigations into North American earthworks. Cyrus Thomas and his team catalogued thousands of sites and published reports that effectively ended speculation about a lost race of mound builders. According to the modern consensus, the mounds were built by indigenous cultures, not some vanished civilization. Most archaeologists agree with that conclusion today, and they're probably right. But I can't prove this yet, and I'm only asking, what if two different things are being confused? What if the identity of the mound builders is one question, and the unusual remains repeatedly described inside some of those mounds are another? Because by the early 20th century, many of the physical sites themselves were disappearing, flattened, excavated, built over, destroyed, and as they vanished, something else vanished with them. The evidence, or perhaps the stories. But the pattern wasn't random, not even close, and when I mapped the locations, something deeply unsettling emerged. By this point, I expected the reports to become scattered, random, unconnected. Instead, the opposite happened. The pattern repeats with unsettling precision. Western New York, Ohio, West Virginia, Illinois, Kentucky, Tennessee, Pennsylvania. Different decades, different newspapers, different witnesses, yet somehow the same themes keep appearing. Ancient earthworks, excavation projects, large skeletons, artifacts removed for examination, then silence. Consider the geography. The Erie Canal corridor opened in 1825. The Ohio and Erie Canal expanded through the 1820s and 1830s. Railroad construction accelerated after the 1850s. By the late 19th century, industrial America was cutting through landscapes on a scale never seen before. Millions of cubic yards of earth were being moved, not in one place, everywhere, and wherever the ground opened, stories followed. Skeptics point out that 19th century newspapers frequently copied articles from one another. That's true. A sensational account in Ohio could reappear in New York weeks later. But the deeper I looked, the more independent reports surfaced. County papers, local histories, personal recollections, archaeological notes, fragments. Never enough to prove anything. Always enough to raise another question. And here's the strangest part. The stories don't center on major cities. They cluster around river valleys, the Ohio River, the Mississippi Basin, the Great Lakes Corridor, places where ancient cultures flourished for thousands of years, places later connected by canals, places where enormous engineering projects literally sliced through the past. We're told that America expanded westward, and that's true. But expansion also erased things. Entire earthworks disappeared. By the early 20th century, thousands of mounds had been leveled by farming and construction. Some vanished before photographs were common. Others disappeared before professional archaeology reached them, meaning whatever they contained is known only through reports written by people long dead. This raises a simple but critical question. What if the missing evidence isn't missing because someone destroyed it? What if it disappeared simply because progress itself became the mechanism of erasure? Because whether you believe the giant stories or not, one fact remains undeniable. The landscapes that once held the answers are largely gone, and that realization led me somewhere I didn't expect. Because the question that kept me awake was different, not who buried the giants, but who built the world those canal diggers were cutting through, and that's where this becomes impossible to ignore. Because the moment you step away from the bones and focus on the landscape itself, a different mystery emerges. We're told that 19th century America was rapidly expanding into wilderness, that cities were young, that infrastructure was primitive, and yet the canal builders inherited something remarkable. River systems already supporting ancient earthworks, stoneworks whose origins puzzled early settlers, cities that seemed to rise with astonishing speed, massive public buildings appearing almost simultaneously across the continent. And this is where the old world theory enters the picture. Researchers in the Tartaria community argue that traces of an older civilization survived into the 18th and 19th centuries, According to the theory, much of what we attribute to explosive industrial progress may actually represent inherited infrastructure remnants, adapted rather than created. I can't prove that. I'm only asking, because certain questions remain. How did relatively young cities produce monumental architecture so quickly? Why were thousands of mounds already considered mysterious by early Americans themselves? Why do so many construction projects seem less like creation and more like excavation? To supporters of the old world theory, canal laborers become something unexpected, not builders, diggers, men uncovering rather than creating, men exposing buried layers, men accidentally encountering remnants of something older. But there is an important piece of counter-evidence. Historians have mountains of documentation, contracts, engineering plans, payroll records, letters, survey maps. The Erie Canal absolutely was built between 1817 and 1825. There is no serious dispute about that. Likewise, archaeologists overwhelmingly agree that the mounds were constructed by indigenous civilizations over many centuries. Their evidence is extensive and persuasive. Those are facts. So does that destroy the entire mystery? Not necessarily, because perhaps the wrong questions are being asked. Maybe the issue isn't whether the canals were built. They clearly were. Maybe the issue isn't whether native cultures built the mounds. They almost certainly did. Perhaps the real question is much simpler. What exactly were 19th century workers uncovering while transforming the continent? Because reports of unusual remains, lost earthworks, and forgotten discoveries don't disappear just because modern explanations exist. And here's the uncomfortable possibility. History may contain both truth and omission, not necessarily deception, not necessarily conspiracy, just missing pieces, missing records, missing landscapes, missing records, missing landscapes. And once you accept that possibility, another picture begins to emerge. One that doesn't replace history, but rearranges it. And if that alternative timeline is even partially correct, then the canal diggers may have been witnesses to something far stranger than anyone realized. Let me propose an alternative timeline, not as a conclusion, not as established fact, just as a possibility. Imagine that by the late 18th century, North America contained far more remnants of the past than we recognize today. Ancient earthworks, forgotten structures, burial sites, river networks that had supported civilizations for thousands of years, some known, others already abandoned. Then came explosive expansion, canals, railroads, quarries, cities, industrialization. Millions upon millions of tons of earth moved in barely a century. We're told that this period represents creation, but what if it also represents destruction? What if 19th century America wasn't simply building upward? What if it was simultaneously digging downward? Because that changes the role of the canal diggers completely. They become witnesses, not archaeologists, not historians. Ordinary laborers, men with picks and shovels, accidentally exposing layers nobody expected to find. And perhaps that's why the reports sound so chaotic. Fragments appearing before modern archaeology existed. Discoveries recorded by local newspapers instead of scientific journals. Artifacts handed to doctors, professors, collectors, or institutions, then lost, not necessarily hidden, simply swallowed by time. And here's the strangest part. Maybe that's why so many stories end in silence, because silence doesn't require a conspiracy. Silence happens naturally when civilizations expand faster than they preserve. Entire earthworks disappear, county newspapers decay. Collections burn, private museums close, witnesses die, and eventually all that remains are strange references buried inside forgotten archives. If that's true, then the giant stories themselves may not be the central mystery. Perhaps they are symptoms, echoes, distorted memories of something larger, something uncovered during the greatest transformation of the American landscape. It would explain why similar stories emerge around excavation projects. It would explain why so many sites and reports vanish before modern investigation. It would explain why the same unanswered questions continue surfacing nearly 2 centuries later. I can't prove this. I'm only asking. Maybe the official story is largely correct. Maybe the newspapers exaggerated everything. Maybe coincidence explains it all. But maybe history isn't wrong. Maybe it's incomplete. And if that's true, then somewhere beneath highways, farms, reservoirs, and cities, entire chapters of the past may still be waiting. Not erased, not hidden, simply buried, waiting for someone to ask the right questions. If you stand in any older city in the United States today, you're walking over layers of decisions made in the 19th century, canals that were later filled in, rail lines that were rerouted, earth that was cut, moved, and leveled on a continental scale. And beneath that, older landscapes that very few people ever think about anymore. This is where the story stops being abstract, because we don't experience history as textbooks. We experience it as streets, foundations, riverbanks, and parks. We walk over it every day. And most of the time, we never ask what was removed to make space for what we see now. When you look at the Erie Canal today, it feels clean in its narrative, an engineering triumph, a straightforward success story. And in many ways it was exactly that. But even accepted history has shadows, uncatalogued finds, lost reports, local accounts that never made it into national archives, small fragments that don't change the official story, but sit beside it like loose threads. And once you start noticing those threads, they become difficult to ignore, because the same pattern appears elsewhere. Railroad cuts revealing ancient burials, quarry sites exposing layered settlements, canal excavations intersecting with burial mounds that predate modern memory by centuries or even millennia. Most of it has rational explanations: erosion, reburial, misinterpretation, exaggeration. And those explanations are often correct. But here's the tension that remains. When you place all of these small, uncomfortable anomalies side by side, they begin to resemble something larger than isolated mistakes. Not proof, not evidence of anything definitive, just a pattern that refuses to fully disappear. Maybe that's all it is. A pattern created by chance, amplified by all journalism, and remembered unevenly. Or maybe it reflects how incomplete our record of transformation really is, because we tend to think of history as something stable, finished, fully mapped. But in reality, it is still being assembled from fragments. And perhaps that's the most unsettling idea of all, that we are not just inheriting history, we are still uncovering it, slowly, unevenly, and sometimes without realizing what has already been lost along the way. We return to where this began, western New York, 1820s. The Erie Canal cutting through land that had already seen thousands of years of human movement, settlement, and burial long before the first shovel of the project ever hit the ground. Men digging, earth collapsing into open cuts, reports surfacing in scattered newspapers about unusual discoveries, large bones, strange burials, fragments that never quite made it into the official record in a consistent way. And then, as quickly as they appeared, they fade. That's the loop, and it never fully closes, because even today, if you search through digitized archives, you still find them. A sentence here, a paragraph there, a mention of something unusually large, a remark about remains sent for further study, a report that ends without follow-up. We're told these are errors of interpretation, and in many cases they probably are. But the discomfort doesn't come from any single report. It comes from their repetition across time, across geography, across entirely different construction projects that reshape the continent. Canals, railroads, quarries, urban expansion. Everywhere the ground opens, stories appear for a moment, and then disappear again. So we come back to the question from the beginning, not whether giants existed, not whether every report is accurate, but something simpler. What exactly was being uncovered during the largest reshaping of the American landscape in history, and how much of it survived long enough to be understood? Because if even a fraction of those accounts point to something real misidentified or not, it means there are layers of history we only glimpsed as they were being destroyed, not deliberately hidden, just lost in motion, lost in progress, lost in time. And that leaves us with one final thought. If so much can disappear in just 2 centuries of development, what else have they erased that we're still pretending was never here? And if you felt that same unanswered tension in your own city, your own landscape, your own local history, share it below, because every place has its own version of this story, and the next investigation starts there, somewhere beneath what we think we already understand.